Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana.
Cha!
I don't know why I decided to start with a musical interlude, but hello, everyone. My name is Patrick, and with me, as always, is my co-host extraordinaire and backup vocalist, Mackenzie Cooper.
Cha!
How are you, Mac?
I'm doing good. I'm just living my best life.
As we all are.
There you go.
Today, before we get into our topic, as always, thank you to our patrons, Craig, Jessica, Elise, Tommy, James, Belinda, and Noah for helping support the show every month. If you want to help the show and join our ranks of patrons, you can check out the links in the description for patreon.com/Historia Canadiana. You can chuck in for as little as $3 a month or $1 a month. But for $3, you get an extra episode a month and actually a lot of extra content that you get early, sometimes weeks ahead of the main feed. So there you go. Currently, there's some stuff that's not going to be on the main feed for like 2 weeks. So consider it. That being said, Mac, today we're going to be talking about Riel again.
Laurier 2, the Métis Boogaloo.
I guess like part 3 in this
part
case.
3 at this point, yeah.
4, I guess, because we did 2 parts on the Red River Rebellion. So
Red
this
River!
is part 4. But like we mentioned in last episode, this time we're purely going to be talking about the trial, his imprisonment and trial after the Northwest Resistance in 1885, because this is considered a rather pivotal moment in Canadian history, and there's quite a bit of literature that came out of it, right? Both in the contemporary moment of the 1880s and since then, right? And we'll be able to talk a little bit about that. But yeah, did you know anything about the trial itself, or had you heard of the importance of the trial?
Yes. If there's one thing I always knew about Louis Riel and always taught, it was the importance of the trial and the fact that it was a total sham.
Right.
It was. If there's one thing anybody knows, it's that the trial is a lie.
In like more ways than one. Like we would have a tendency to assume when we hear, oh, it's a lie, that it was on the part of the Canadian government, which in many cases it was, by the way, absolutely.
Oh, God, yeah.
But also on his legal team's part, like there was a lot of fuckery going on that
the only one who stood true to himself the whole way through was Louis Riel.
And the Métis people, who a lot of them stood by him. But yeah, like in the context of the trial, absolutely. Yeah. And he got screwed over. I'm gonna like the debate's gonna go on forever about like whether he was insane or not, and et cetera, et cetera. Regardless of where you fall on that, I think as a person, he got screwed over and his lawyers didn't act like his lawyers. And that's a shame. So when we last left off, what do you remember from the actual events of the Northwest Rebellion that we talked about 2 weeks ago?
It was a rebellion. The railway, new technologies basically made them really easy to suppress. A couple minor skirmishes, but it was a lot of fear mongering at the time. McDonald used this opportunity to finally squish the rebellious people.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think another point that we should mention, because those are all good points. A last one that we should mention is that, again, the Métis and the Indigenous peoples and white people who were part of this resistance all did try to send demands before firing weapons, and they waited months before anything happened, and nothing happened. And that's when it led to armed conflict. But there were genuine attempts to create a peaceful talk here, right? Or at least a reasonable talk, if one that was a bit antagonistic, perhaps. But yeah, so there were attempts. And ultimately, like you were saying, after these skirmishes, Riel would end up being captured and giving himself up and taken into prison.
Right.
I want to mention this now. There were talks among the Métis people while Riel was in prison to try to break him out, but ultimately this never materialized. So we're not going to talk a lot about that just because it just wasn't a historical event. It just never happened, but it was something, right? The Métis people were not passive towards the fact or indifferent to the fact that this figurehead was in prison. Ultimately, they chose not to or couldn't act on this. Okay, so what I want to start off today, I want to separate up this talk into sections, right? His prison time, his trial time, and the aftermath of this trial. And so starting with the prison itself, right? Just to set the scene a bit, Riel was in a state where he basically had no contact with the outside, or very little, right? The inspector who was in charge of keeping him in prison, in this case in what was then the Northwest Territories, nowadays it would be in Saskatchewan, he was concerned about a flood of journalists and Métis sympathizers showing up in the barracks that Riel was kept in. And so he ordered, this is Richard Dean, by the way, the name of the inspector, ordered that no one could visit Riel without an explicit letter from the prime minister.
Of course.
So, starting right when you were mentioning that he got royally screwed over, cutting someone off.
Step one.
Yeah, there you go. Like from the get-go, cut off from the rest of the world, right? That being said, there is paper evidence now that he did get some telegrams from people and, from lawyers and supporters. So eventually there were communications with the outside, but this was mostly during his trial. While he was in prison itself, not really, right? And this is where we'll get to like how he passed the time a little bit later, because he was virtually cut off.
God.
And to make matters worse, Riel had to carry around a literal ball and chain whenever he entered the barrack yard, or either for fresh air or exercise. So he was constantly chained up and had no possibility of escape. Right?
Which, McDonald, yeah, this is a good idea. This isn't going to turn anybody against me. No way.
I mean, at this point, there's like an almost complete control of the narrative, right? Because imagine you're in the 1880s in the middle of the Northwest Territories. Nobody's going to come, aside from locals, there are very few people who are going to know about what exactly happens here. So yeah, he does absolutely control the territory.
I'm just saying, like that's, you're creating something that's going to fall apart. Like there's no, you can't, nobody can control that kind of stuff forever.
Yeah. Absolutely.
The spread of information is going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And part of the way that we have information is that for the 8 weeks that Riel was in prison before his trial, he occupied himself by writing religious poetry, which we're going to look at a little bit, letters to...
Sorry.
What? I mean,
it's just like, what political operative that's been in prison hasn't written poetry, It's like that wartime poetry that soldiers write and they come back out. It's all very nice, sort of, but it's all kind of ends up being similar or the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's either, depending on what you're there for, it's either poetry or some kind of radical manifesto.
Right.
So, like those are the two
Sometimes
options.
Both.
Sometimes both. Or if you're the Marquis de Sade, writing weird fan fiction on toilet paper. So yeah, he would write religious poetry. He wrote letters to relatives and friends. So that's one of the main reasons that we can know for sure how he was treated over there. And general notes about his own religious thought and political movement, right? We're not going to be looking at the latter two today, but they exist. A lot of them are publicly available in archives. Not a lot of them are digitized, but they are available to the public and addressed in a lot of texts about Louis Riel. And the final thing before we get into the poems and trial itself, just to set the scene, Riel was charged officially with, quote, wickedly and maliciously and traitorously making war against Our Lady the Queen, and maliciously and traitorously attempting to, by force and arms, subvert and destroy the constitution and government of this realm. Based on what we talked about last time, do you think that this is a fair assessment right off the bat?
Not really.
I wouldn't say so, no. Yeah.
It's, how do I say this? If the larger issue was that, he launched, because even with the rebellion, it wasn't always his.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And even if he's he was just trying to get what they were almost promised more than anything.
Yes.
So it's not, you can't, I don't know, he's not really fomenting rebellion if you guide him to the,
I agree. And I think that point of having promises being respected is a central point. They were all explicit about this. We don't want to destroy the Constitution. We want to make sure that what you promised us in the very Constitution of places like Manitoba and Canada is respected. We're trying to uphold the Constitution, not destroy it in many ways.
You were supposed to bring balance to the Constitution, not destroy it.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, it is true that they used force and arms, but it wasn't for the sake of destruction or any kind of traitorous movement. He wanted, like, a lot of them wanted to be part of Canada, but on an equal footing, right, as themselves.
And also, like, he used force. Everybody was using force. It wasn't like he was doing anything new.
And they tried the peaceful method. They tried sending letters, and you ignored him. Despite knowing the lessons of 1869, you chose actively to ignore him.
You can only knock a man down so much before he decides to just go fucking ballistic on you.
And you can argue, like, for the relevance of armed tactics all day. I can understand why he would have, like, gravitated towards that. Right. I understand the reflex to go for more radical methods when everything else fails. Right.
And all else fails.
Yeah. Anything you want to add about this before we get into some of the poems?
It's easy to say that the trial was rigged, and it was, and all these other things, but I also think it's important to know just how deep it went. Like, it wasn't anything as blatant as, the judges are all gonna say this automatically. No, this is all based on, like, everything technically being legal, but all the choices were made in the worst way possible.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't something as simple as, we're gonna, you are now this. Like, we just paid the judge. There's no point anyway. Like, no. There was the ball and chain, the not letting people in to see what was going on. There was all these other things that were added on top of it, you know?
And yes, you could argue that the law was respected, but it's a very tenuous look at the law that they could have avoided if they wanted to.
Yeah, there was, like, they knew what they were doing.
Yeah, it was planned, and we'll get into the details of how that was done a bit later, but it's hella sketchy. Right?
Hella sketchy.
So the poems that we're going to be looking at specifically, these ones are found on Wikisource, right? But there are plenty. There's actually a whole book of collected poems of Riel that exists that was edited a few years ago. It's pretty cool, but I couldn't find a digital copy to actually use for the show. But there's a few that are available online for free, and I think some of them are kind of cool. Some of them are pretty straightforward, like. If you want to look at the first one in the link that I sent you, Mac, which will be available in the description.
The I must speak of God.
It's like you were saying, it's a pretty straightforward religious poem in this case. I must speak of God in whom I trust. In him I have room to hope. The rope threatens my life, but thank God.
Thank God I fear not.
All right.
I must speak of God in whom I trust. In him I have room to hope. The rope threatens my life, but thank God I fear not.
Many of these, by the way, are translations. The book I mentioned earlier has both the French and English, the original French and the English translations, which is kind of cool.
French and English. That's what I'm talking about, baby.
Yeah, and there was another one that I wanted to mention. It was, the third one that starts with prophet.
Prophet.
This one I thought was also pretty emblematic of Louis Riel himself and how he saw himself. Prophet of the new world, I do the work of the Most High. I assert it with no pride. I live in humility. Is there any one to side with me? Yes, sincerity will gather up its recruits, and we will soon taste its fruits. Slap.
Slapper dapper.
But I do find it interesting how he blends the political and religious in this case.
Right. Well, this wasn't at this point where church and state separated fully.
I would say no. It's kind of nebulous. Like, there was never officially a state. I don't think there was ever officially a state religion in the Canadian Constitution. But arguably for a long time, most of the people were either some branch of Christianity, or there were a few Jewish people, but that was pretty much the limit of state-sanctioned religion. And that was reflected also in who was allowed to emigrate to Canada for a long time, or who was allowed to stay in Canada. So officially, I think it was separated, but in reality, there was a bunch of ways in which, Christianity and Judeo-Christian thought in general was perpetuated in Canada. But yeah, because it's interesting that he calls himself a prophet.
Why?
Well, because that's a part of a historical debate about him, right? A lot of people point to a lot of people point to the fact that he believed himself to be a prophet as proof of his failing mental state and his sanity, right?
Well, here's because I've thought about the whole prophet thing a bit. Basically, also especially because of how we talked about it last time, and I think I found out why his spiritualness claimed in a Christian viewpoint would have rubbed people the wrong way because of the importance of who gets selected to be spiritual in Christianity. Yeah, and so it's not in saying it's impossible for him to claim to be a prophet, but it is it's not. The prophets have always been mostly coming from around Israel and around the place of Israel, right? Or somebody who'd be more affiliated with the church, like the Pope, His High Holiness. So, what made Louis Riel seem so insane was just how far he was removed as a person from the church. Like, this was not a man who had gone on pilgrimages within Europe, within the Middle East. He had not been to the holy places. He had not been to these like valued holy places of the religion, but suddenly he was a prophet. It sounds a bit like John Smith, who found the golden plates for the Book of Mormon.
Right. Is it? Yeah. Is it John Smith?
I think so.
I know.
Not Smith, the John Smith you're thinking of.
Yeah. It was a different John Smith, right?
Okay. Yeah. It's just that John Smith was a very popular white person name.
Right.
The whitest of names. I swear to God.
Joseph Smith, by the way.
Joseph Smith.
Sorry. Yeah, this way.
Yeah,
I knew there was
Smithy.
a J. Joe Smith.
Joe Smithy, here dropping his golden plates.
But it's interesting because there are known saints in the Canadian canon who were Indigenous.
For sure. But there's a difference between being a saint, which is just being somebody recognized for like good deeds, and being somebody who speaks with the voice of the Lord. Yeah.
And it's also interesting, it's like these saints are recognized because I'm creating the parallel here between Indigenous populations, but these Indigenous saints, I'm thinking particularly of a 17th century one called Catherine Tekakwitha. Who is, I believe, an Iroquois who was baptized as a Jesuit, but I'm not sure anymore. Some Catholic branch. And I think she's recognized because she integrated the system of Catholicism pretty much as was expected of her, right, in this sense. Whereas Riel is using the name and voice of God in opposition to.
That's true.
Right.
That's true. He's coming in conflict with what, like, if the Pope had ever released a statement at the time and said, I sided with Louis Riel, I believe his visions of religion and the Lord, that would be one thing. But
there's no way the Pope knew about Louis Riel.
No.
Like, I'm sorry, like, we know about him, but there's no way that would have ever been.
No, exactly. Just based on technology. Like, it's not even a case of like, oh, the Pope doesn't care. It's like, no, it's just technology at the time would not have been conducive to that kind of messaging.
Also, I don't think he would have cared.
No, that too. But from a pure logistical standpoint, it's already impossible.
Yeah.
So, and I think because part of Louis Riel was his insanity plea, because that wasn't even his choice, though.
No, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, it wasn't him that wanted to be.
Like, I really gotta wonder where his, like, if I want, it's one of the questions I would ask him if he were still here. What made him believe that he was a prophet? Like, where was he drawing this authority from?
Yeah, it would be very interesting.
On what basis?
Just basing it off this poem, for example, I think prophecy in this case kind of takes on the form of hope for the future. Not necessarily saying that he himself will lead or change the future of Indigenous people immediately, but that the actions that he brought about kind of had this domino effect.
And they kind of did.
And yeah, absolutely. Right. And there's a reason why we still talk about him today. But I don't think he meant it in the literal sense, or at least in the sense that we imagine it today, of like Jesus as a prophet, right? Who was literally the son of God or anything like that, or had visions from God. But I think in the sense of he had hope for the future, and he was able to imagine a future in which Métis and Indigenous and white Canadians lived side by side.
Right.
And in a sense, that's kind of a prophetic, like, that is a prophetic move, right? It's less in the religious sense. Move.
Boom, bitch.
Whether or not that came true, I don't think so in this case, because there are still a lot of problems, as we've talked about, between these relations. But it is a prophetic move insofar as he's imagining a future horizon in which that happens. right?
Right.
But yeah, you're right. I do think it would be interesting to ask him like how much, like what he saw as his role as a prophet.
Well, more just like where he believed that authority came from.
Yeah, interesting. I don't know. Anything else you want to add about the poems?
I like that he keeps them short.
Yeah.
They get to the point pretty quick, which is nice.
At least he keeps his poems short, if not his statements.
Well, no, I think it's also like this was very much I am putting out like this is almost his answer to the question of where he gets his authority. Like this is him saying very simply, this is where I get my authority, the Lord.
Yeah, and that's explicit in the next one after, right? In the one below. It never shines as much as the word of the preacher who developed the blessed teachings of the Lord, right? He's a devout Catholic, right? And he's interpreting the world in that sense, in which
as a devout Catholic.
Yeah, and it's like a big part of Catholic dogma is suffering will allow you to, achieve some form of salvation. That is a big part of it. Obviously, it's major. Obviously, it's major in like Jesus as a figure, but just in general, that's a big part of a lot of Catholic dogma, right? You will suffer for your sins, and that will allow you a place in heaven.
You will suffer for your sins.
It sounds apocalyptic, but that's it, right? And I think that also fits in with the prophecy element. It's like we're suffering now, but as we're seeing in this poem, we have people that support us, and it will lead to a better future, right? Because without this suffering, nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to change, right? And I think that's a religious move in itself. We not necessarily in the sense that we think about it now in a very secular world that we live in, but I think in itself that is a religious move of having faith in a better world.
Right.
All right. Now we can get into the meat and potatoes of this episode, the trial itself. Ah, God. So as we were saying, Riel was tried for high treason at Regina in the summer of 1885. Right? The actual facts of the case were not really what was being debated in court, right?
No.
There was armed conflict, right? Riel was at the head of it. There were Indigenous people fighting alongside Métis people, so on and so forth. All of that is pretty much undeniable, and nobody, even Riel, refuted that. I was like, yep, I did that. But what was being argued was why, right? The actual reasons for the resistance in this case. And as we've kind of been alluding to, Louis Riel's defense team believed that the only possible argument that you could make for this was an insanity one, based on what they saw as religious delusions.
Right. Which I feel like was just another way of them fucking him over.
But here's the thing is like the defense team was not hired by Riel.
No.
And because Riel had no money to pay for them, they were hired by a group of Quebec Catholics that supported Riel. And so they listened to those people who hired them rather than Riel. They followed the money, basically.
Yeah.
Which I get, but also as a lawyer, you're supposed to actually respect your client's wishes in a sense, even if you don't agree with them. That's something that the book I mentioned earlier, Jean Teillet's The Northwest is Our Mother. Teillet is herself a lawyer. Right? And that's something that she's explicit about. It's like, that's just lawyer 101 is that you don't go again, even if you don't agree, you can convince your client of otherwise, but
at the end of the day,
you're there to make the client's wishes as palatable as possible and to defend their wishes, right? That's their job.
I wish upon a star.
And yeah, we'll look at it a bit later, but Riel basically refused to go along with this line of argument, right? He didn't want to die as a madman. He didn't want to go down in history as an insane person, right? And he even wrote a statement for his lawyers that was meant to educate them about the reasons why he started the resistance, telling them exactly what we were talking about last time. And, they accepted it, but it was a bit, they were humoring him, right? A lot of historians today are like, yeah, they were humoring him. They didn't really intend on going forward with that path of reasoning.
Right.
There's a really interesting passage, if we want to kind of touch upon the sanity thing a little bit. There is an interesting passage in Jean Teillet's book that I want to mention. Yep. Where is it? Damn, I think I wrote down the wrong. Yep. I wrote down the wrong the wrong page number, I think. Damn it.
Damn it. Gosh dang it.
Oh yes. Okay. Here we go. You know, most of, according to Teillet, right, most of his family and friends never believed that he was insane, right? And he suffered from bouts of depression and emotional disturbances, as one in his position would, right?
Mhm.
And there were even 3 doctors that over the years had studied Riel for for like various bouts of depression, right? As we were mentioned last time, he went into an asylum.
He was depresso.
Right. And all of them swore to his sanity. And we're like, no, he's not healthy necessarily, but he's not insane. Right. And there's a really interesting case in which in the late 1870s, so not long before this, right, Riel wrote this letter, and I think it kind of is indicative of what I'm talking about here. I have come to see myself a prophet. It seemed to me that the papacy should leave the moth-eaten soil of Europe for the New World. I saw the light of civilization grow from the Orient, the Euphrates, Palestine, Rome. It seemed to me that it was America's turn, and I believed that I had an important role to play in the new order of things. My pen and sword I tried to make converts. However, one day, tired of fighting opposition, I asked myself if I was right or if everyone else was right. At the moment, the light came to me. Today I am better. I laugh myself at my hallucinations of my brain. I have a free spirit, but when one speaks to me of the Métis, those poor tragic people, the fanatic Orangemen, of the brave hunters who are treated like savages, who are my blood, of my religion, who have chosen me as their leader, who love me, and whom I love as brothers, alas, my blood boils, my head gets on fire, and it is wiser if I speak of other things. To me, that doesn't sound like an insane person.
No.
That's like, on the contrary, that seems like someone who's well aware that, like, yeah, I had a rough go at it, but then I got over it.
I got better. I got over it.
Yeah, like literally he says that. So to me, it's a non-issue. I don't know if you have anything that you wanted to add about that in particular, but to me, I find it very hard to believe the insanity.
Oh, he was not insane.
No.
God, no.
You may disagree with him, but he knew exactly what he was doing.
Say so.
And, or at least during his bouts of depression and instability, he wasn't acting in those moments, right? He actively sought help. Okay. Before we get into the trial proper, I do think it's important to kind of set a bit of behind the scenes for what's happening in the halls of power as the trial is being set up, right? Because the initial conflict garnered major support, right? In 1885, we were talking about that. There were thousands of soldiers that they managed to bring forth to save Canada, right? From the, terrible Métis people who want to destroy everything.
Métis people.
Even though there are only a couple of hundred people in what is not even a province yet. So not much of a
Métis
threat.
people.
Yeah, exactly. But as the trial would go on, and people learned more and more about Riel himself, like from his own mouth, as opposed to through the newspapers that were very supportive of a war, the issue kind of became more and more divisive, right? On the one hand, you had the conservatives, who at this time were still led by Macdonald, who wanted this to be over so quickly, right? They wanted to avoid public pressure, right, on this expansion project that they were going forward with. And the Liberals and French Canadians, on the other hand, increasingly came to sympathize, right? And some of them even downright supported Louis Riel's actions. Because remember, this is around, I don't think we've talked about this, but this is around the time that a kind of new wave of French Canadian nationalism was birthing. This is around the time when people like Henri Bourassa would emerge in Quebec and start talking about sovereignty, right?
Oh, no.
Already at this time. And so when you have a figure like Riel in the West, who's French Canadian and Catholic and actively, taking up arms against British hegemony, well, suddenly to Quebecers, that looks hella satisfying.
Yeah, they underestimated, I think, the Conservative Party really underestimated just how much Quebec did not like them and what they had done over the years.
And it's really with this moment that, because for a long time, the Conservatives did have a hold on Quebec, but because of the church, right? The church was a rather conservative institution. And so that kept it. But was suddenly what you see politically after the Riel affair and trial, suddenly the conservative hold, like you're saying, just withers away, and it will actually change the political landscape in Canada quite significantly. And the fact that the fact that Riel was like a God-fearing French speaker very much appealed to Quebecers, particularly, and French Canadians in general. But the Liberal Party as well also specifically would come to blame the Conservative government for the uprising, right? They called the Tories, they called them out basically for mismanaging the situation and not handling it in a way that was appropriate. And they basically blamed them for you could have avoided bloodshed here, right? There was not necessary, right? Whether you agree with Riel as a person or not, it was not necessary to send basically, to send the military and militias over there. And it kind of came to a head during the trial when many petitions were signed, both by opponents and supporters, right? So on the one hand, you had Orangemen, who we talked mostly about in the 1860s when we were talking about the Red River Rebellion, who sent petitions that demanded swift justice, right? Without any clemency. They're just executed, right? And however, you also had a lot of petitions, over 50 of them actually, that demanded that Riel get a commuted sentence, right? But what I find particularly interesting, and we'll look at one of those ways in which people demanded better justice, right, with another poem, is that many of these opinions point, without necessarily saying it, point to the lack of a fair trial, right? Because on the one hand, you have conservatives who are like, just get this done. I don't care what it takes, just get it done. Right. And
don't do it well.
Yeah. And on the other hand, you have liberals who are like, no, this is not being done properly. Get it done properly. And you'll see that he deserves better than what he's getting right now. Right. So either way you look at it, you kind of see that there's a failure of the justice system that's happening.
Right. Also, just a failure of planning on the part of the party, the part of Macdonald.
Yeah.
He did not run this operation well. He looked down on too many people and too many factors.
Yeah. He thought he was much more in control than he actually was.
Yeah, he did not know how deep, for example, the Liberal strength went. He didn't understand just how much French Canadians would sympathize against English colonials.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And he forgot the one truth of Canadian politics that has remained true to this day for a mind-boggling number of reasons, but you need Quebec to win elections.
Yeah, it was true at the time, and it's still true today. Well, not as true today. That's true. You can win without Quebec, but yeah.
It would be a hard election to win without Quebec.
It would be, but it's mathematically possible. But yeah.
It hasn't happened just yet.
Yeah, or at least it was a very tight race. Yeah. And so in keeping with this idea of petitions and demands that were signed, there's a really interesting work that was published by a certain, I always get her name wrong, Agnes Macher, M-A-C-H-A-R. Machar. And yeah, so her poem is a bit long. We're not going to read it out, but just the name of it does indicate what we're going for here, right? Of people wanting clemency. And the poem's called Quebec to Ontario, a plea for the life of Louis Riel, 1885.
That's sweet.
And it's actually I'm actually surprised that this kind of work would come out around this time, because this is the kind of criticism that you would see today of a lot of the way that Canada was formed as a modern nation state. And you can see that right in the first two stanzas. You have the land our fathers bought with blood and toil and pain, de Mont and Cartier's earnest thought, the lifeblood of Champlain. From fair Acadia's rock-bound strand to wide Ontario's shore, the Norman swords fought hand to hand, the Iroquois of yore. Mm-hmm. And those great western wilds afar, where wandering Indians roam, and where the hardy voyager first reared his cabin home, all is yours, from east to west, the British banner streams, but in a conquered people's breast will live its early dreams. Mm-hmm. And I find it kind of interesting. Agnes in this case makes a particular reference to the fact of like, you have your hegemony, like you're in control here. And it was brought about through violence. So right off in the first stanza, she's like setting the scene here in this case. You have nothing to fear, right? It is British. Right?
It's British.
And all that the people in the West want is, like they're saying, to make sure that their dreams are respected. And she finally ends the poem towards the end with these last two stanzas. While he who sought his people's weal, he being Riel here, who loved his nation well, the prisoner of your fire and steel lies doomed in felon's cell. Pity the captive in your hand, pity the conquered race. You, strong victorious in the land, grant us the victor's grace. Mm-hmm. It's there can be something to say about the fact that she just wants to give, that she uses the term pity in this case for Indigenous populations. There's a bit of kind of what's the term for this, paternalism, I feel, that exists in using such a term. But I think the idea is interesting nonetheless, of saying like, no, the executing him is not the solution in this case, right? It's not going to solve the inherent problem that is caused by this, right? Mm-hmm. You're just pushing it under the rug, but you're not actually making the problem disappear, right? And ultimately, Riel is a person who fought for what he thought was right, and that doesn't deserve death, right? And I think it's really cool that such a poem would exist in the 1880s. Mm-hmm. Right? I don't know if you had much to say about this. I think it's a pretty straightforward poem, but I just thought I would mention it.
Yeah, it all makes sense. It's all straightforward.
Yeah, exactly. By the way, this is part of a collection called Lays of the True North. She's a pretty good poet. Not like the most
good chips.
Yeah, not I wouldn't say she's like the greatest poet I've ever read, but there's some good turns of phrase in this that are worth checking out. And it's free online.
It's free.
Yeah. Welcome to the public domain, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, getting into the trial itself. So the trial, as you were saying, is mostly remembered for the way that it fucked Riel over, right? Like, yes, that's pretty much how it's gone down in history. That and how it reflects the divisions in Canadian society that are still around today. Mm-hmm. And Teillet in her book brings up 4 particular ways in which Riel was screwed. One was in the charges themselves. The second one is the venue where it took place.
Right.
And 3 and 4 kind of mix together in so far as the defense preparation and the lawyers themselves. Mm-hmm. We've already talked a little bit about the lawyers and defense preparations, but we'll develop a bit of the ideas that we addressed before. So the charges themselves. So we already talked that Riel was charged with treason, right? But something that I didn't know that Teillet brought up is that MacDonald and the Justice Minister, right, Sir Alexander Campbell, decided to charge Riel with treason under a specific statute.
Of course.
The 1351 Statute of Treasons, which in this case was a British law, right? And at this point in Canada still respected a lot of British law when it came to treason and stuff like that, because we were still a dominion, right? So that was like the higher law of the land in this case. But why? Why go all the way? Like, it's literally a statute that was 500 years prior and that had been updated since. But they chose specifically to try him under this statute because it is the only one that guaranteed that Riel would die. Like, all the others offered other options, but the 1351 statute, the only option for treason was hanging. Mm-hmm. Right? And so if he was found guilty, that would be an automatic death sentence. Right? And that's what Riel wanted. Right? That's not what Riel wanted. I'm sorry. That's what MacDonald wanted. Right? And it was also a way to kind of justify the massive expenditure of the conflict by saying, okay, well, we're not just going to let him go to jail for a little bit. We're actually going to end this in a public display of force. Right? See, it was worth it because he's a terrorist, you see.
Mm-hmm. God damn.
Yeah. I don't know if you have anything to say about this, but this is just like, this to me is egregious and shows how fickle sometimes law can be, especially at that time.
I mean, even by today's standards, the justice system and the charges, that's a big way of how corrupt the justice system can be, is how people are brought up on charges and the little loopholes that they will use to bring them up on certain charges to make it more or less severe.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you think that's kind of not something that you see today. Just look at how the Patriot Act was a thing in the US after 9/11, right? Which basically gave the state an incredible amount of power to search people who were ultimately not terrorists, right? So this kind of thing still happens today, right? It's a question of loopholes, right? Like you're saying.
Well, and we'll even just look at how drug possession of drugs is handled. It can be handled where people will get no sentence at all based on who they are, just because they all get a different kind of trial, or they'll be very heavily penalized and put into prison unfairly.
Yeah, absolutely. And something I want to mention here as well, and this can kind of lead us into the venue itself, right? So we're talking about MacDonald and Justice Minister Sir Alexander Campbell. And some people might be thinking, MacDonald's prime minister in this case. He doesn't have a direct link with law. He should be dissociated from it. But that's why Riel was not tried in Manitoba, as was originally planned, because Manitoba was a province, right, that had its own justice system that was able to do certain things. And we'll get into that, specifically what the difference is. He was tried in what was at the time still a territory. And what that did was that the judge that was presiding was an appointee. He was not an independent judge, right, as he would have been in a province. Right? So because he was appointed, basically the judge, in this case, Judge Hugh Richardson, could literally lose his job if he didn't deliver the results that MacDonald wanted.
Yeah, they're kind of sucked in that way.
Yep. It's like either you don't do your job as you see fit, or you do and you get to get paid. Like this is kind of the the option here for Judge Richardson. Judge Richardson also didn't speak French, right? Which,
of course,
doesn't help, right? Usually, especially
that doesn't help anything.
No, like when usually here in Canada, we allow people to have recourse to justice in the language of their choice, right? And this was denied to Louis Riel. But again, no one gave a shit.
Who would?
Yeah.
Imagine giving a shit.
Yeah, exactly. Why would you? What is that? Right? Actually caring about the people that you're sending to hang. In Manitoba specifically, if we want to make a comparison, if the trial had taken place there, Riel would have faced a jury that was composed both of French and English people, right? It would have been both. And I think it would have been 12 people in total. Whereas in the territory, because those same rules don't apply, and because there wasn't as big of a diversity of population as existed in Manitoba, for example, the jury was composed of 6 white Anglo-Protestant men. That's it, right? They, again, did not speak French. They were not the same religion as Riel, and they were not even the same background ethnically. So he was getting screwed over on the judge part, on the jury part, on the language part. Everything was going wrong in terms of the venue in this case. And finally, right, we can talk about the defense preparation and the lawyers a little bit. Ultimately, as Teillet mentioned, they never respected Riel's wishes. That would never go through. Despite his pleas, they would go forward with the insanity, right? They could have read his statement in court, but they didn't, right? They could have even called some of the Métis prisoners who were literally held next door to justify, to speak in court, and that was never done, right? They went full on with the religious insanity part.
Yay.
But I do feel like, despite all this, and we're not legal scholars, so we're not going to go into like the fine details of what the trial like is. There's actually a few good websites that go point by point over how who was asked. And there were, for example, doctors that were asked as witnesses who could testify to certain things and so on. And there were all kinds of witnesses, but all of this within the framework of insanity, or to paint Riel in a bad way on the opposition part. But yeah, I just don't feel like going through all of it. What I think is really interesting to look at, though, is Riel's final statement, right? Basically, I think this is a really big power move on Riel's part. So his lawyers, right, his legal team would spend the entire time trying to paint him as insane. And then Riel would come out at the end with this statement that basically convinced the entire jury that he wasn't. Right? In a single statement, which is pretty long. So he has time. He just proves them all wrong. He's like, nope, you chose not to listen to me. F you. I'm going down in history as being perfectly cogent. Right. And I know you kind of skimmed through the statement because it is very long, and that's fine. But do you have anything to say about the statement in itself, like what it says and how it makes Riel sound?
About his long statement,
the final statement. Yeah.
I mean, if nothing else, it proves that he's sane.
Yeah.
Like, like you can't have a man who can speak that long and that eloquently.
Yeah.
And then say
that cogently.
Mm-hmm. And it goes to show just how dangerous it is not to respect the wishes of the person you're defending. If you don't work with them, they can fuck over your entire case.
Yeah.
No matter how hard, no matter how rock solid a case might be, if the defendant doesn't want to go along with it, you're screwed.
Yeah.
Like, so if they really should have just done what Louis Riel wanted.
Absolutely. And we can get into, I can understand why Riel would want to go down in history as someone who wasn't insane, right? As someone sane. But I feel like, and I've seen some interesting arguments in this case of saying that he ultimately he had too much faith in the legal system, right? He believed that if he did demonstrate that he had good moral values and that he was doing this for the right reasons, that they would have forgiven him. Right. And I don't think that that's true necessarily. I think he was set to die regardless, right? And so it's interesting to think of the statement as his attempt to clear his name and to maybe get out. But history has kind of gone on to interpret it as, no, this is him proving that he's not insane before he dies, right? And kind of securing his place in history. And honestly, this is a beautiful speech. Like the way it's written, as you were saying, is eloquent. And there's some really interesting imagery that he plays with that I was not expecting for a trial statement, to be perfectly honest. Like, actually, there's some places that right in the second paragraph that he mentions a bit of what you were talking about, right? The second paragraph is all about his faith in God. You have seen by the papers in the hands of the crown that I am naturally inclined to think of God at the beginning of my actions. I wish if you, I do it, you won't take it as a mark of insanity, that you won't take it as part of my play of insanity. Oh my God, help me through thy grace and the divine influence of Jesus Christ. Oh my God, bless me, bless this honorable court, bless this honorable jury, bless my good lawyers who have come 700 leagues to try to save my life. Bless also the lawyers of the crown, because they have done, I am sure, what they have thought their duty. They have shown me fairness, which at first I did not expect from them. Again, like pretty ballsy move of just like going into a prayer right in the middle of right at the start of your statement, but also demonstrating like, no, I'm a God-fearing man like all of you, right? And I'm doing this willingly. But then he shifts in the third paragraph. The Northwest is also my mother. It is my mother country, and although my mother country is sick and confined in a certain way, there are some from Lower Canada who came to help her to take care of me during her sickness, and I'm sure that my mother country will not kill me more than my mother did 40 years ago when I came into the world, because a mother is always a mother, and even if I have my faults, if she can see I am true, she will be full of love for me. And that kind of leads him into explaining his actions in this case, right? I found the Indians suffering. I found the half-breeds being eating the rotten pork of the Hudson Bay Company and getting sick and weak every day. Although a half-breed and having no pretension to help the whites, I also paid attention to them. I saw they were deprived of responsible government. I saw that they were deprived of their public liberties. I remembered that half-breed meant white and Indian. And while I paid attention to the suffering of Indians and the half-breeds, I remembered that the greatest part of my heart and blood was white, and I have directed my attention to help the Indians, to help the half-breeds, and help the whites to the best of my abilities. We have made petitions. I have made petitions. Asking to relieve the condition of this country. We have taken time. We have tried to unite all the classes. Even I may speak all parties. I find this like, damn. I mean, he's just laying the truth out, I think.
Yeah, the man is just laying out his truth.
Yep. And I find it very interesting that even as he's about to get hanged, right, it's going to happen not long after this after this statement, a few months after, that he still kind of is clement in a sense towards his captors. He doesn't try to antagonize them, right? He tries to show how they can find common ground, right? And I feel like that's an interesting strategy in this case. I don't know what to make of it per se, but I think it's interesting to at least mention it.
Well, I think, I think it shows a real foundation of Laurier's character. Yeah. Despite it all, at the end of the all, he stood tall, he stood true, and he held his head high.
Yeah, I do recommend. Sorry, go ahead.
I think that's what makes him such a powerful, enduring figure, is that in a time of compromised morals, backdoor doors, which he probably took part in, he's still he's much more upstanding than many other politicians and figures of the time and place.
He stuck to his guns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And but for a twist of fate, there's a very good chance he could have been a real party leader, heck, maybe even prime minister.
Right. Well, that's kind of interesting, because it just after his final statement, the jury would find him guilty, but they did recommend clemency, right? They didn't want him to die, right? So despite having the deck stacked against him, the jury did ultimately get swayed somewhat, right? Yeah. They didn't think that. But really, let's be honest here. The jury was a sham part of the trial, because again, the judge, in the way the British system is done, the judge does have a certain level of ability to make their own decision. And in this case, he chose to ignore this, right? And Riel was condemned to death. Right? There were many appeals to higher courts, namely in Britain, but these all upheld the same verdict, right?
Which was a shame.
Yes. Right.
They were going to lose it all.
Yeah. And as Riel was about to hang, right, and this is something that was brought up in Teillet's book as well, MacDonald would make a statement that I think would really summarize, his position on this, and how French-Canadian relationships with the Conservative government as it stands now would continue going forward, or at least for a long time. And he would state in a private note, he would say, "He shall hang, though every dog in Quebec bark in his favor." Just killing two birds with one racist stone in this case, and saying, no, fuck them all, right?
Fuck everybody. I do what I want.
I don't care what Quebec thinks. I don't care what the Métis think. He's going to die, right? Yeah. And this is going to affect MacDonald's career for the next 6 years of his life. He's still going to win another election. He's going to die in office in 1891. But it's still a severe blow to his career. And rightfully so.
Well, it goes to show that without him then there to hold everything together, it's all going to fall apart.
Yeah. And I want to talk briefly about the aftermath, right? So as we mentioned, this came right around the time when there was a rising nationalist movement in Quebec, right? Which would only grow over time. Well, it would come and go, to be fair, but it would reach obviously its peak in the 70s here. But it would kind of sow the seeds would be very much sown in this moment. And Riel's hanging in November of 1885 would give a certain young Wilfred Laurier and the Liberal Party in Quebec their first real opportunity to break the conservative stronghold on the province.
Yeah, let's go!
And which is very ironic in many ways, right? It's simultaneously indicative of the direction in which Canadian politics are going, where Wilfred Laurier was a bilingual person, right? He came from Quebec and he spoke both languages, and he very much ran on a platform of blending both parts of Canada together, right? Acknowledging that French Canada is a thing and English Canada is a thing, but still managing to have them work together as two distinct people, right? And it's interesting that, he would use Riel's death, right, or the event of Riel, in a sense, to do this, but ultimately he would actually be quite detrimental. His government would be quite detrimental to Indigenous rights in Canada, and actually removing a lot of rights that they had prior to their government arriving, right? So there's a bit of a historical irony happening here of Indigenous people allowing Laurier to emerge, but also him fucking them over royally.
Yeah, let's go. Let's fuck them over.
And yeah, we've alluded to this briefly, but maybe you can talk about this, about why that perhaps is the case. But I do think it's important to note that Riel's life extended long after his death. Right. And the fact that that he's still the subject of books, right? There's namely The Scorched Wood People by Rudy Weeb that would be written in the 70s. There are plays that were written, poetry. A lot of them comes out of Quebec, but not exclusively, right? For a lot of Métis people, Riel is still a figurehead, right? And it's interesting that, especially in times of upheaval in Canada, right, his kind of name would reappear, right? And we kind of continue to gravitate towards him as a symbol, in a sense. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about why him in particular, right?
Yeah.
I asked you a question.
Oh, sorry. Restate. Sometimes the words get so long I forget where the question is in them.
No, I asked like why you think that he would remain this figurehead, right, throughout time.
Because people love heroes and they love villains more than anything else. Like the history of mankind, I said we love good stories, and for those stories to work, they need to have hero and a villain. And really, Riel's story is one that goes to either side of the line. Like he is a Moses figure. He literally left, explored another place, and came back. And then decided to fight for his people. Like even if he wasn't claiming to be a prophet, the religious overtures are there. And this is what makes it even more fascinating, is that this isn't some random or false account. This is like, we know this happened. We tracked how this happened. Like and I think that's the power of his myth, is that there is a very strong sense of sincerity there. You know, John MacDonald's myth, he created. He found it brick by brick, based on shadiness, lies, and that sort of stuff. And that's its own use. That's its own special type of myth, and it has its own uses. But Louis Riel's power is in its truth. There is very little that is fake about this man.
And that's the thing, is like it in many ways it reads like I think you really hit the nail on the head on this one. It reads like something that you would find in a fictional tome. Like it reads like an Odyssey or something like that, of like this person standing up against the might of the Canadian state or something like that. But no, it's just a history, right?
It's a history.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes it so appealing. It's like in the minds of people, it reminds a lot of writers or hopefuls in a way that there is more power to be had among a population, among the little guy, than perhaps we might assume, right? And I think that's a comforting idea to have, and it's an empowering one in many ways. I don't know. I feel like his myth is going to stay, but obviously we can't know for sure. But I feel like it's one that still to this day, despite there being relatively little upheavals in Canada since, say, the 70s, I think he's still in the back of people's minds as someone that we can turn to as emblematic of how to struggle against an unjust world, right? Yeah. I don't know if you have anything else to add about that, about anything that we talked about today. I feel like I talked more at you today than
it's okay.
usually.
And I think this is very much a case of the facts speaking for themselves. Like we're getting out of time where there's a lot left to interpretation. We're getting very much into this history that we have recorded, we have settled down, and there's no way we're going to cover the domino effects and the outlying ripples of the Louis Riel trial within one episode.
No.
The kind of discussion that involves, both from a legal standpoint and the kind of precedent it sets for Canadian trials going forward, but also for how it shifts and changes the political landscape. You know, it was because before they were almost able to use Riel as a unifying force between Ontario and Quebec. But now, by over-relying on that and having Quebec people go out to fight the devil Louis Riel, they realize he's not that different from them, which in itself creates the largest splinter between Francophone and Anglophone. So what we're doing now is basically like trying to almost explain the importance of the largest aspect of Canada's political landscape today. The Canadian modern political landscape is always going to rest upon that divide, the idea of, what to do with its first cities and first province. What it's going to do with its original colony, alongside the question of the First Nations people, which again, Louis Riel was a major part of. And so Louis Riel himself is an emblematic figure just as much as John A. Macdonald of what the average Canadian looks like.
Yeah.
What are the values and ideals of the average Canadian person?
Mm-hmm. And I don't think it would be much of an exaggeration to say that this, more than 1867, is the birth of the modern Canadian nation state, as we understand it now, with all its divisions and its intricacies, right? I think that prior to then, it was mostly, yes, we obviously heard about French rights and Indigenous rights. Those were a thing. But I think this is really now the time in which there was an active addressing of these things on a legal scale and on a national scale in a way that hadn't been quite done prior, right? And that will, even if not directly, be addressed. And that's why I wanted to mention at least the lasting effect on literature. Even if not directly addressed, it'll always be in the cultural background of Canadians' minds going forward, right, to this very day. So yeah, I don't know. I think the last thing I wanted to mention, I do think that in his statement, it was very interesting that he creates the parallel between two mothers, like two parents in a sense, right? The land and Jesus in a sense, the land and God. And I think that also in a way is emblematic of what you're saying of the Canadian mindset, right? Riel himself, as we've been addressing, is kind of like debatedly seen himself as like, he obviously saw himself as Métis, but he also wanted to be a part of the Canadian state in a way. But I feel like in those two paragraphs, he very much sums up the Canadian national project in a way of tying one's identity to the land, which we've talked about with recent poems like the E.J. Pratt one that we did on the last Spike, as well as attaching yourself to Christianity and faith in a better progress, right? Which will also exist for a long time. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's pretty much all I have. Anything else?
No, I don't think so.
All right.
Read the statement for yourself. Judge for yourself about Laurier's insanity. Because might be an argument to be made that such a long statement meant that he was having insane thoughts. Like, who knows?
I feel like he prepared it well and advanced enough that he knew exactly what he was doing.
No, what I'm saying is like the actual content is what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Like insane people can speak well. They can speak very eloquently while still being kind of psychopathic. Who knows?
Yep.
I don't think Laurier was insane. I think that was a total fabrication, but like, I'm not going to tell people to make a judgment. I'm going to say judge for yourselves.
Yeah. It is interesting that Teillet would bring this up at the end of her chapter on the Northwest Resistance. It's like, mostly the debate is with white historians. They're really the only ones who are concerned still to this day with Riel's sanity. Like everyone else has kind of put this to rest. Right? And the only debate is among others. And I'm curious as to like, I don't think we will talk about this today. We're kind of wound down, but like why that is the case. Why are they so fixated on Riel's sanity? Right. Could be interesting to think about further. Right. I don't know. All that to say, thank you, everyone, for listening. Mac, where can people support us?
With thoughts and prayers, they can send us emails, letters. Check us out on Facebook, on Twitter. Let us know what you think of the show. If you have complaints about the show, let us know. If you think I talk too little, Patrick talks too much, let us know. If you think I should talk less and Patrick should just do the whole thing himself, let us know. We can also support us on Patreon through affiliate links and just by spreading the word.
Yep, absolutely.
Let the people know.
Thanks again to all our lovely patrons, and we'll see you. Yeah, next week we'll record a Pop Canada, and then we'll see y'all in 2 weeks with a brand spanking new episode on the free feed. Woo!
Woo!
All right, cheers, everyone.
Woo!